This week's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by the Texas Tribune Membership Program. Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for February 10th. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, joined as always by Editor-in-Chief Matthew Watkins.
Hello there.
How's it going?
Good.
Yeah.
Just, enjoying the Winter Olympics and,
yes.
all that it entails.
Huge Olympics heads over here.
Mhm.
Are you in the Talk Olympics channel on Slack?
I am, but I have not chimed in yet.
Same. I feel like it's too embarrassing to be like in the middle of work being like making it so obvious that I'm watching the Olympics. But they're in a different time zone. Well, as we've discussed frequently on the TribCast, our podcast hosting demographic is pretty firmly in the millennial category. We were once described as being being millennial funny, which was devastating to me. Meant as a compliment, hurt really bad. But today, as we're going to be talking about sort of TikTok, social media, influencers, online outrage, how all of that is impacting the 2026 primary elections, we are thankfully joined by two Gen Z voices. Politics reporter Kayla Guo.
Hey.
Thanks for being here as our
happy to be
Gen Z correspondent.
Yes, that's me.
Yeah. And then Democratic strategist and online content creator Olivia Juliana. Olivia, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Kayla, did you write about the influencer role? Like, did you get selected for that story because you were Gen Z?
Now I'm thinking
speechless.
about
she's
it.
like,
Wow.
we got to call Jasper in here.
Didn't even occur to me until right now.
I think it probably was due to your otherwise phenomenal coverage of that Senate race.
Yeah, what's up with that?
But
Okay, look, I just want to say that I think you can write about all generations.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can write about boomers. You can write about the silent generation, the greatest generation. But we do tap you to write about Gen Z sometimes because it would be embarrassing otherwise. For those of us who are, a little bit older.
It's okay.
I am really, really online though. So I really do think I could hack it. Well, let's take a step back and talk about the story that you wrote, Kayla, this sort of drama that bubbled up in this Democratic primary for Senate. And after that, we're gonna take a step back and talk about this issue more broadly because it's sort of a symptom maybe of a larger theme. But what happened here?
A lot. I think it was last week. Last week on Monday, a content creator, she's based in Dallas. Her name is Morgan Thompson. She was previously a Tallarico supporter before Jasmine Crockett got into the race. She made a TikTok alleging that in a private conversation with her, James Tallarico had referred to Colin Allred, who is a 2024 Senate Democratic nominee, who's in this race, but dropped out as Crockett was getting in. She alleged that Tallarico referred to him as a, quote, mediocre black man. That video went viral. She laid out some of the context of the lead up to the conversation, and that on its own would have been somewhat remarkable, like how big this video itself got. But then, of course, Colin Allred weighed in, made his own selfie style direct to camera TikTok video, in which he just ripped into Tallarico and all but called him an outright racist, endorsed Jasmine Crockett. And that is, of course, when it sort of became news for us. And when we wrote about that whole thing going down, and Tallarico's camp took a while to respond that day. Tallarico said it was a mischaracterization of what he had said. He had referred to Allred's campaigning as mediocre, but would never, attack him on the basis of race, is what his statement said. But that was really... that whole blow up was kind of the culmination of what had been going on for weeks on X, Threads, TikTok, Instagram, of just a lot of people chiming in with really strong takes one way or another on this race, and becoming sort of a battle between these two camps, even though the candidates themselves have sort of stayed out of the fray. And so this was really just the blow up and, peak of this long simmering hostility.
Right. Before we sort of get into that, broader context, Olivia, you were watching this unfold. What were you making of this as a, may I say, very online Democrat?
Yeah. My inclination obviously always is to look at things as a very online Democrat, but I was also looking at this through the lens of I am a 23-year-old voter who lives here in the state of Texas and who will have to cast a vote in this primary election. Um, and who, like, I've known all three of these people in this story since 2021 when I started at like 17 years old. And so seeing all of this play out, I had many thoughts. First thing was, if you just flashed back to the 2024 Senate campaign, seeing these two people, James Talarico and Jasmine Crockett, who were like very visible surrogates for Colin Allred, now entrenched in this um, I would almost say proxy war through these different online factions and not through the things that came out of their own mouth. It was very different than what we've seen in Texas before because of the severity and the volume of it. There was very similar chatter to this in division like this during the 2024 Democratic primary between Roland Gutierrez and Colin Allred, but it was much more insulated to people who were very hyper online in Texas. Whereas this, and I think it's because Jasmine Crockett is such a renowned national figure, really broke out into like national online conversation. And I think that's because of her, but also because James Talarico is a social media star in his own right. Like, I don't think I can name any other state rep in the country who has over 1 million followers on Instagram. And so I'm just kind of watching all of this unfold, and the two main thoughts that I had were, God, it's always Texas, isn't it? It's always Texas. Where we end up
That
having
keeps us in
conversations
business.
like
Yes. Yeah.
100%. And the secondary thing was, I think it's just a reminder of how powerful social media has become in influencing political conversation. Because even if, these posts aren't reaching a significant percentage of primary election voters, the Texas Tribune is reaching a pretty significant percentage of primary electorate voters. And now, like, you all have written articles about this. So, like, it is something that's breaking through, whether it be on social media or because of the traditional press coverage that comes from these incidents happening on social media.
Olivia, I want to ask. Uh, your, I appreciate you saying that. I'm curious about the Texas Tribune reaching a large number of voters. I'm curious though, as someone who I feel like is smart enough to observe this and be like, wow, this is really important and meaningful and says a lot, not just about this race, but where politics is going, but maybe someone who's not smart enough to know exactly what it means. I'm curious whether you think um, this is a bad sign or a good sign for the primary.
Do you mean like
Because
the average person who comes across it?
well, just that this is happening, right?
Yeah.
Because what I'm talking about myself not
Oh,
being
I
smart
see.
enough
Right.
to
You're like, this is happening. It is
and I
obviously
can't.
something.
But yeah, I don't. Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to gauge here is a it's a sign of division and like some hard feelings in this, and I can see how that could be frustrating for someone who cares about the party and where it's going. On the other side, hand, it suggests a level of engagement in this race and a level of like emotional excitement and feeling about these two candidates that is pretty rare in Texas, at least for a statewide race. And I could make the argument of like the fact that these fights are happening is an indication that there's a level of excitement that could be really good for Democrats in
All
this
press
race.
is good press.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, how do you sort of evaluate that calculus?
Yeah, I mean, I think this being a good or bad thing, it really depends on which candidate you are and which campaign you're in. If you're Colin Allred, this is the most social media engagement I think he's gotten. He was the Senate candidate in 2024. Peace and love. Much
Yeah.
respect to Congressman Allred. Um, if you're James Talarico, this is a really bad situation for you to be in because he surged in this primary very early on. His largest fundraising day of that quarter was the day that Jasmine Crockett launched her campaign. Which I think is a pretty clear indicator that she's a very polarizing figure, and that kind of pushed a lot of people who may not necessarily like her style of politics to inadvertently support James Talarico. But if you're Jasmine Crockett, you're someone who you were down at a couple of polls, you haven't been able to match Tallarico's fundraising numbers, you haven't been able to put up as many TV ads or do as many ad buys. Like now you have a lot of organic, unpaid media attention happening amongst highly engaged people who live inside of Texas and outside of Texas, which is important for your volunteer base. It's important for phone banking, it's important for door knocking, and most importantly it's happening a week 2 weeks out from the start of early voting. And so as all of this has happened, she's gained momentum and Tallarico has lost it. And if you're him, you already have the disadvantage of not only are you having to spend money to tell people who you are, but also to bring people out to vote. Whereas her name ID is high enough that people already know. So now, like, all of this, I think, has been really good for the energy of her campaign. Because I think it is really well, I don't think, I know from the conversations I've had with pro Jasmine Crockett influencers, like, this is very, very energizing to them. And like, they are ready to like hit the pavement to help her win this primary versus a lot of the pro James Tallarico influencers who I know are a little bit more hesitant to post positive things about his campaign that they otherwise would have because of how controversial this primary has become.
Kayla, I mean, these are people who have been as you noted in your story, right? They both sort of rose to prominence through going viral, through like grabbing these moments. But I would argue in like sort of very different ways, right? I mean, I think Representative Crockett is like known for these like very sort of huge flashpoint moments, like sort of like the clapback style, really like aggressively calling out Republicans, and some, and then Tallarico is sort of doing this more, the pastor, the peace and love thing, the, running this through this, I would argue like slightly more low key God and good manners pitch. I mean, how this has all played out seems sort of in line with that. I think the Tallarico thing, part of why I think this broke out of containment is like this allegation is so at odds with his public persona. I mean, how much of this is just a consequence of all of this being everyone involved being very online?
I mean, I think, yeah, I think the fact that there has been so much discourse, like Olivia said, one, both of them have such huge profiles. Obviously, Jasmine Crockett more than Tallarico, but are so known online. And I think people do form somewhat like parasocial relationships with anyone who they think is like fighting for them or is aligned with them, is this breakout star in politics that they maybe will get to vote for one day. Um, and yeah, I think people like really latch on to figures like Jasmine Crockett, like James Tallarico, given their, how visible and online they are. And I do think that has deepened sort of like this particular conflict and made it all the more, hostile and people entrenched in both camps.
But Olivia, you were quoted in Kayla's story saying we would all do a lot of good if every once in a while we realized social media is not real life, right? And then you also said earlier, a little surprised me, like one of the ideas that this is a concern is that it has broken through into traditional media like us or the Associated Press or all the other media that has written about this in recent times. And I guess like I'm a little bit surprised to hear that, right? Because I mean, many of the people on social media, myself included, agree that maybe it would be good for us to like at times turn it off a little bit. But I mean, I feel like one of the things that this campaign is testing is the idea of like, is social media the dominant sort of political like place for conversation right now in a way that like it doesn't matter if it's being discussed everywhere. If it's being discussed on social media, it makes a big difference. And I mean another part of this is just there's been some reporting, some concerns out there right now about the lack of spending by Jasmine Crockett on television, the traditional place where you sort of get your ads out right now. And I'm curious whether you think like that matters at all. Like do we are we all sort of still judging this by the wrong metrics.
Yeah, I think in a post 2024 world, I think everyone is very quick to make snap judgments about social media and how it's effective or how it's ineffective. I've seen a lot of people give like really haphazard analysis about, well, what should we do instead? And like I actually don't think that this race is the best test on is it worth it to spend on traditional advertising versus social media, because we do not have two traditional, candidates going up against each other. Like Jasmine Crockett could spend $0 in this race and still have more name ID than James Tallarico. So like even if you don't see anything on social media or on television and you go into that voting booth during the primary election, there's still going to be a significantly larger number of people who know who she is, who have no idea who he is. And so I actually don't think that this race is the best place to kind of draw that conclusion. What I will say is, I think that their electoral theories of change very closely mirror their social media strategies. Jasmine Crockett her arguments have consistently been about, we need to turn out base voters. We need to energize the base of people here in Texas who are not voting or who have voted before and have chosen not to vote in 2024 or in the 2025 down ballot elections. Versus James Tallarico, whose argument is, we need to have a big tent, we need to bring in independence, we need to persuade people. And I think the social media content and spaces that they've been in and the people who have been speaking out in support of them kind of mirror this strategy really well. You see Jasmine doing a lot of social media collaborations or being defended a lot by people like Elizabeth Booker Houston, Kenny Walden. Like these are people who are really known for being hardline democratic political content creators who are pretty decently well known among a large number of primary voters generally around the country. These are political influencers. Versus James Tallarico, you see him and he's doing more of his own content creation stuff, but he's also reaching out to more non-traditional political spaces. He was on Joe Rogan last year. He went on Ezra Klein's podcast to talk about Jesus. Like he's doing a lot of different things that you don't see candidates traditionally doing when they're trying to use social media in a political way. And I think that the true test will come not necessarily from is she spending money on TV or is she not spending money on TV. I think the true test will be which one of these social media theories works. Is it appealing to the base of online primary voters who are going to show up to the primary, who are highly engaged? Or is it trying to add people to the primary electorate and persuade people to become Democratic primary voters who traditionally may not have been involved in those elections?
I mean, looking ahead to the general, where one of these two people will inevitably be running against one of two other people, maybe current Senator John Cornyn or Attorney General Ken Paxton. I mean, how does all of this shift when we start looking at a general? I mean, we've currently have Democratic infighting that will all sort of miraculously disappear on March 4th, and we'll all go back to being friends. And then now suddenly you are trying to reach a much wider swath of the electorate with a much typically, like I think, more moderate uh, platform on a lot more sort of different venues. So, Olivia, I'm curious, like, how you see this shifting, sort of the campaign strategy shifting going into a general.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's going to be really dependent on who the Republican candidate is. Because the social media strategy of whoever it is going to be very different. Than, like John Cornyn's social media strategy is, I feel in the instance of him, it's very much so you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. Like it is very clear he is not comfortable with social media. His team does not really understand it. Wesley Hunt is doing his best. He's trying to lean into the rage bait content of it, but Ken Paxton ultimately, when it comes to social media, I would say that Ken Paxton and Jasmine Crockett are probably like a perfect inverse of each other when it comes to engaging and enraging people on social media and getting a reaction. And social media algorithms don't measure feelings. They don't know how you feel or what your opinion is when you make a post. All that it measures is velocity and volume. And so, if you're someone like Ken Paxton or Jasmine Crockett, who is known for getting very strong reactions out of people, when you make a post on social media, you're likely to get that strong reaction from people on the left and on the right. And when you get that combination of reaction from both sides, that can catapult you to reach those people on the periphery who are not necessarily political. And those people on the periphery are the ones that are the reason why Donald Trump won the 2024 election, because they were getting reached in those spaces. So I think if this were going to be a true, like, brawl in non-traditional voters who are getting their information on social media, the Ken Paxton Jasmine Crockett lineup, I think we are going to see a social media war waged in this state we've never ever seen before. I genuinely believe this could be like presidential level engagement numbers from these two, just because of how polarizing and cutthroat they both really are. Versus if it's someone like James Tallarico, that's just not his style. Like, I don't think you're ever going to see James Tallarico call Ken Paxton an adulterous fraud, which, like, frankly he should. But, like, it's just, I don't think the engagement is going to be the same. Now, I do think that there are a lot of people out there who are these more, mild mannered, moderate independents, traditionally like Reagan, Romney Republicans who do exist in Texas, who probably would vote for John Cornyn in a primary, who, if Ken Paxton is the nominee, there's a really strong chance that they could end up voting for James Tallarico. I think the only person in this scenario who really is a wild card is Wesley Hunt. If for some reason he wins the primary, which I do not find to be particularly likely, I think that really is the only unknown scenario of how this is going to play out on social media.
Before we move on, I just want to take a quick break to say that TribCast is made possible by members of the Texas Tribune. This election season, help ensure every Texan has access to trusted information about what's on the ballot and why it matters. Together, we can help Texans vote with confidence. Join us at texastribune.org/donate. I mean, I do want to sort of revisit this idea of just these. I think in many ways, and this is not a unique thought, like the Republican and Democratic primaries in this race are sort of, like you said, inverses of each other, right? You've got a like polarizing, really, not to undermine either candidate's sort of governing power, but like polarizing performers versus these sort of people casting themselves more as statesman style, at least moderate in tone, if not in sort of political ideology. Kayla, I mean, we have no idea what which two pieces of this quadrant are going to end up with each other, and with the Wesley Hunt piece of this as well. What is your sense? You've talked to a lot of voters, you've talked to a lot of campaign consultants. Like, what are the bets everyone is sort of making? I don't mean the predictions. I mean, like, what are the different sort of personalities that we're investing in and sort of gambling on what voters want here?
I mean, I think what you'll hear consistently, excuse me, is that just like people don't know James Tallarico, and that has been a big challenge for him. Um, but I think exactly as Olivia said, like in a reflection of Jasmine Crockett and Tallarico's different approaches and theories of how to win statewide, I think both of them will point you to, what they think voters want is, of course, they think themselves. I think, Jasmine Crockett will talk a lot about people who like are watching her on the front lines of Washington now, who know that she's going to show up for them and fight for them and deliver for them in the way that she has been in Congress. And they want someone who, and she'll tell you that they want someone who is like fired up and will fire them up. I think Tallarico's camp, on the other hand, will point you to like a lot of disaffected independent and Republican voters who are just like tired of the division, and the polarization and the fight and like the social media division and misinformation that is like pushed by algorithms, and looking for someone who is like normal and willing to like bring people together. I think when I've gone to Jasmine Crockett's events, it's a lot of people who really, really admire her for her, being a fighter, for being willing to like say whatever, even if it makes other people upset. Um, at Tallarico's events, I have met a lot of Republican voters or like formerly Republican voters who are now looking for something different and are very much into, his sort of inverse message of like, we need to come together enough with
Lower the
this,
temperature
lower
on
the
all of this.
temperature,
Yeah.
like it might be entertaining, but like it feels terrible to be constantly in this state of political fight.
I don't think we can talk about this though without getting into the conversations around race that have come up in this, right? This idea that, I mean, part of James Tallarico's pitch is that he is a more viable general election candidate for all the reasons that you described. That he can win people over, that Texas is not ready to elect someone as confrontational as Jasmine Crockett. This of course touches on some topics that are very fraught and complicated, right? And people will point out that issues of electability and things like that are often used against Black candidates, particularly Black women. And it feels like Tallarico. I mean, Olivia, you sort of talked about how like some of his supporters have maybe been more hesitant to speak out in his favor out of concerns about blowback and everything like that, perhaps for this particular reason. But there is also a very large segment of people talking about this race who are saying the Democratic Party cannot get into this situation where you cannot, talk about winning the general election, where you cannot talk about electability and all those different topics. There's a theory of the case that a like focus on race and an unwillingness to criticize candidates of color over any particular issue was part of what turned off a lot of like moderate voters in the first place. How do you see this conversation playing out, and do you think this criticism against Tallarico, or maybe more specifically some of Tallarico's supporters, is a fair one?
I think that first and foremost, I think that the people who have really negatively polarized this conversation most often than not are people who do not live inside the state of Texas, people who do not vote here. And based off the conversations that I have had with people who support Jasmine Crockett, who support James Tallarico, both inside and outside of the state, a common thing that has kept coming up to me is people who have seen these accounts, who have very vocally supported James Tallarico, making electability arguments, critiquing Jasmine Crockett, but those same social media accounts also praise Graham Plattner in Maine for his, brash, blunt, non-traditional style. And that's where a lot of these very strong, negatively polarized positions come in is, well, you're making these electability arguments about Jasmine Crockett that she's said hyper partisan things, that she is aggressive, that she is very out there, and that's why we can't nominate her. But you also support a candidate who, frankly, has a lot more electoral baggage than she does. Um, and that begs the question of, well, why is that? Is it because Jasmine Crockett is a Black woman and because Graham Plattner is a white man? Or is it because you think that these are different political environments? And I'll say I talked to one influencer in particular who has been kind of in and out of this race a little bit, and um, they told me if the Tallarico supporters on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, if they really wanted him to win this primary, all they had to do was let Jasmine lose. And what they meant by that is all you had to do was talk about why you prefer your candidate instead of attack the credibility and the history and the record of Jasmine Crockett. And I think that that is a very valid opinion to say. And in the article that Kayla wrote that I was quoted in, I did say like a lot of this is not necessarily that people are extremely passionate about James Talarico or extremely passionate about Jasmine Crockett. It's that people have been negatively polarized into having these very strong opinions because of the attacks that they've seen on social media. And I think a lot of this is left over from the 2024 election, where there were a lot of really unfair criticisms of Kamala Harris that were made about how she couldn't be the nominee, about how Biden had to stay in because America wasn't ready to elect a Black woman. And frankly, like me as an individual, someone who has been very vocal about how I am voting for James Talarico, um, like my reasoning for voting for him is he speaks to me on a personal level with his story and his record more than Jasmine Crockett does. And you don't have to denigrate the other candidate to prove your point about why you want to support the opposing candidate. And so I think that this is just kind of a remnant of a lot of people feeling like there was no real resolution to a lot of the inter-party conflict that happened post 2024 election. And I think that Texas has kind of become a stand-in for a lot of those leftover feelings because people feel like they're feeling and seeing a lot of the same attacks. Um, I don't know if we're going to get a resolution from this race. But what I do know is that I don't think any campaign in this primary or in Texas in general, I don't think anyone has navigated this situation correctly. And I think that I don't know that a productive conversation is going to come out of this. Moreover, my concern is that this is going to lead to more resentment. And, I think it was you, Eleanor, who said, after March 3rd, it's all Democrats are all friends again. I don't know that we're going to see that happen. I don't know that we'll see James Talarico and Jasmine Crockett campaign together. I don't know that we'll see the Senate candidate campaigning with Colin Allred or Julie Johnson in their congressional district. Like, I think that this may genuinely be an inflection point in Texas politics around this topic of conversation. And frankly, like maybe it needs to happen because Texas Democrats haven't won a statewide election in 30 years.
Right, I definitely feel like there was that talk of like this inflection point after 2024, like you said, but there wasn't maybe as much of a I don't know, there was just so much national noise to sort of drown some of that out that now it is the family infighting is like out on a national stage. I mean, certainly I think that's happening on the Republican side as well, right? I mean, they're deciding what they want, their future to look like, their nomination, sort of through their nominee. But I do just briefly before we wrap up, Olivia, I do want to talk about, President Trump, who I do think has like uh sort of lassoed this outrage economy and this attention economy in a way unlike almost any other, modern presidential president or like modern candidate really has. Um I mean, what sort of sets him apart and like how has he shifted all of this to make sort of this landscape for this kind of moment?
Yeah, there is no politician in the history of America who is better at commanding attention or dominating the attention economy than Donald Trump, period. I've heard a lot of people say, Donald Trump broke the Republican Party. I would argue that he broke the Democratic Party too, because trying to figure out how to compete with his ability to command the narrative has been so difficult. Democrats have been trying to do it for 10 years. Um, I think that he really changed this in the way of politics has kind of always been this game of decency and respectability. And I think he completely threw that out the door. And when you combined his very harsh, aggressive political strategy with, what I was talking about earlier with these algorithms that incentivize strong reactions and high volume reactions, it just leads to this combustible situation where the political narratives are just constantly on fire. If something is breaking through online, it's because you are seeing pure anger from people on the left and on the right. The only moments that I can think of that have seriously broken through in the last year were the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And that's because half of the country was talking about how much of a tragedy it was, and the other half of the country was justifying why it happened. And I think that is the outcome of Donald Trump being at the forefront of this. What I will say is, I think that Democrats are finally learning from not just 2024, but from the kind of dip that they had through the 2020 to 2025 when Biden left office. The social media strategy people talk about with Donald Trump, about how he was so brilliant in campaigning in 2024 and campaigning online and in social media spaces. That was not Donald Trump's strategy. That was Joe Biden's strategy in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic that he set up, and kind of loosened a lot once, traditional campaigning came back and Donald Trump and his campaign realized what it was, and they picked it up and they kept it pushing, and it was wildly successful. And so I think that the place that it's brought us to in modern politics is that the incentive structure for our politicians is different, because now it's not just, my comms director needs to have a good relationship with the booking producer at MSNBC or with the, head politics writer at Texas Tribune. It's, I need to be saying things that are outlandish or outrageous or powerful enough on social media that I'm getting a reaction from both Democrats and Republicans. And I don't know that that incentive structure is necessarily healthy for democracy, or that it's healthy for politics in general, because I'm of the opinion that the incentive structure for politicians should be that you get to win your election and you get to keep your job, not I'm going to get a million likes on this social media post calling an American citizen who was killed by a federal agent a domestic terrorist.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, two things that have been said about James Tallarico on this podcast was low key God and good manners, right? But also, Olivia, you said that he's probably the only state representative in the country to have over 1 million followers on Instagram. I mean, it seems like what he is trying to do with his campaign and his persona is rise in this world with a different strategy. And what maybe this race is setting up is a test of whether that's possible, because I do think, you know, regardless of your feelings of how this is or who she is as a candidate, Jasmine Crockett displays a lot of those uh, strategies that Donald Trump does too. I mean, her most famous phrase is what, like, bleach blonde, bad built butch body, right? Which is pretty caustic and pretty confrontational and got a reaction from both Republicans and Democrats. So, I mean, I think that is why this race is so fascinating. One of the many reasons why this race is so fascinating is that contrast in styles, but it's still sort of in a lot of ways taking place online.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are a week out from early voting, so we will soon be able to, discuss what this all meant and do our post-game analysis in just less than a month. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Kayla as well. This week's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by the Texas Tribune membership program. Our producers are Rob and Chris. You can find us anywhere you find your podcasts, and we will see you next week.